The fight over medically transitioning kids, or what's known as gender-affirming care, is possibly the most heated and divisive of our time. But it's not a simple case of red versus blue. On the side of restricting treatments for minors are right-wing conservatives and liberal feminists and gay rights activists. These strange bedfellows may have different beliefs about gender roles and sexual freedom, but they're united against treatments that became standard pediatric care without good evidence.
When I first made the critical decision to become a whistleblower, I went back to the very basics of science. Is this intervention given to children helpful or harmful? Do the risks outweigh the benefits? Are these children getting better?
Jamie Reed used to be a caseworker at a leading gender clinic that follows the guidelines of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. Now, Reed testifies in state legislatures about how patients, families, and even physicians were misled. Because what's come to light in recent months is that WPATH, a nonprofit organization of clinicians and advocates whose mission is to promote evidence-based care, manipulated and concealed the evidence that informed those guidelines.
Families couldn't know that these guidelines are not of true value because I didn't know that. I went into this care thinking WPATH SOC7 was a well-established, research-based standard of care that had decades of real evidence behind it, and that's just not the case.
In the United States, WPATH has effectively set the standard of care, saying that treatments like puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries are life-saving, medically necessary, and backed by science. But independent evidence reviews have come to a different conclusion.
There's very good guidelines on things on which we have a lot of evidence, like neonatal care or how to manage diabetes in children and young people. But this area in children's gender medicine was just strikingly weak compared to almost any other area that I've looked at. So it was a sort of standout in terms of the weakness of the evidence. For example, there's no evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving, that there is a reduction in suicidality for young people when they go on to puberty blockers. This population of young people is a group that is at risk, but they're at risk because of a whole series of complex issues going on in their life.
The CAS review was commissioned by the English National Health Service, but its findings are relevant to every single young person who's gender questioning and every single youth gender clinic in the world, because we actually don't know, when it comes to the use of puberty blockers, for example, are they harmful in the long term? We don't really know. Are they beneficial? We don't know that either. But in medicine, if you don't know if something is safe or clinically effective, then you would tend to err on the side of caution, and you wouldn't just keep prescribing routinely, which is ultimately what Dr. Cass concluded.
That's how many European countries are reacting. For instance, Sweden issued guidance in 2022 restricting treatments for minors based on the finding that the risks outweigh the benefits. Those guidelines got high praise from Cass's review, while WPATH's got low marks, raising, quote, serious questions about the reliability of current guidelines. Since then, even more questions have been raised.
The story is really quite remarkable. It's a story of how WPATH originally, in 2017, really appeared to have a good faith plan to systematically appraise the evidence and to update its standards of care 7, which was not evidence-based, and they acknowledged it wasn't. They plan to update it with a true evidence-based guideline. And so in 2017, WPATH commissioned an evidence appraisal team from Johns Hopkins University.
The team at Johns Hopkins was charged with conducting what are called systematic reviews of the evidence. These reviews form the basis of an evidence-based recommendation. But by 2020, WPATH was making it difficult for the team to do its work.
In 2020, apparently, Johns Hopkins had done dozens of appraisals. When WPATH saw the manuscripts, they became gravely concerned. So much so, they issued a new policy stating that Johns Hopkins cannot publish any research unless members of WPATH Standards of Care 8 chapters were directly involved in the approval of the content of the reviews, the conclusions of the reviews, and they had to be part of the drafting. At first, Johns Hopkins really pushed back on this. And then, a lot of the documents are still redacted, so we don't have all the detail. But what we do know is at the end, Johns Hopkins appeared to have succumbed to the pressure because following this new policy, the dozens and dozens of reviews that they say in writing they'd concluded are still yet to be published.
Laura Edwards-Leeper served on the committee that wrote WPATH's guidelines for adolescents.
At the beginning, WPATH leadership told us that that Johns Hopkins would be helping with the literature reviews and that part of the process, which was welcome news. We were all very happy about that, to have more of a systematic process in place. But it was shortly after we got started, we were told that Johns Hopkins wasn't able to do the systematic reviews because there weren't enough studies. So that was disappointing. And we were told at that point that basically when there aren't enough research articles to do an actual systematic review, the standards of care would just be based basically on expert consensus and, looking at the articles and the research ourselves, but not in a systematic way to come up with the guidelines. And so that's what we ended up doing.
Despite what WPATH told Leeper and her colleagues, it appears that Johns Hopkins did, in fact, conduct a review on gender-related treatments in adolescents, and it found little to no evidence, but it was never published. WPATH's 2022 guideline revision was also expected to recommend age minimums for treatments like testosterone, estrogen, mastectomies, and other surgeries. But a strange thing happened at the last minute, and the age recommendations disappeared. For more than a year, nobody knew why.
We initially had age recommendations in the standards of care. We changed them from what they had been in the previous version, but we all had agreed on that being an important piece to include. So near the final hour, it was like we'd gone through the entire process, and then we learned that we were being strongly encouraged to remove the ages. And that came through, the chapter leads had been told by the leadership that was something that we needed to do. There was some discussion around it being in part due to the American politics. And a lot of us pushed back hard on that. But in the end, it seemed that there wasn't anything we could do about it.
The pressure was coming from two places: U.S. Assistant Secretary of Health Rachel Levine and leadership of the American Academy of Pediatrics. But it's evident from the emails turned over to the courts that WPATH was also doing its own strategizing.
They're stating very clearly that they're being advised by social justice attorneys that are fighting lawsuits, and they're also talking directly about the need to compel insurance companies to cover these interventions and to consider them medically necessary. And so every decision is not in pursuit of science or evidence-based medicine, but for two main goals. One is how to compel insurance companies to cover the interventions, and two is how to win lawsuits.
When all this made headlines, WPATH defended itself. The AAP invited Admiral Levine to give a keynote at its annual conference. This signaled to activists that all parties stood by their actions, and they wanted to hold them accountable. So Jamie Reed led a group to Florida.
So we've just been having more and more conversations about protecting gay kids. So many of us as adults grew up with the experience of gender distress, gender incongruence, gender nonconformity, however you want to describe it, and we grew up to be gay adults. And I think more and more gay adults are getting the concept down that we have to be the ones to step in, that this really is an internal debate within our community, and the only real voice that's going to be able to fix this is from within.
If you look at the criteria for childhood gender dysphoria, I, as a child, ticked every single box. And no one to this day has been able to tell me how they distinguish between children that would grow up to be gay and so-called trans children. This is a co-opting of a very common homosexual experience in proto-gay youth, and it's being medicalized.
Lauren Legiri was able to get into the convention hall where Levine would be speaking.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction and that welcome. It is wonderful to be at the American Academy of Pediatrics. Everyone in this room works every day to benefit the public, protect children from harm, and make our communities whole. It is essential to address the unique health challenges that arise during this time. We encourage the adoption of innovative approaches, including the use of technology and telemedicine, to reach adolescents where they are and to provide them with the care that they need.
Hey, if you all can get on Twitter. Yes. Okay, so I just put out a tweet. Lauren screamed at Dr. Levine in the middle of the session and disrupted the session. The police apprehended her and they were talking about charging her with trespassing. So we just threw out the Gives and Go for the bail fund, and then Ben Ryan's got the picture of her being detained. Did you hear it? Yes! You disrupted the whole fucking room! They cut away to the front. They like cut back, and the people in the front were like turned around like, what the fuck is happening?
I yelled, "Why did you pressure WPATH to remove age restrictions? Most gender nonconforming kids grow up to be gay. Stop transing gay kids." And I said, "You are all complicit in homosexual conversion. Stop transing gay kids." As clear and loudly as possible.
When asked directly, Admiral Levine declined to answer questions.
Excuse me, Admiral Levine. My name is Jennifer Block. I'm a journalist. Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Right now.
Could you please tell us,
interviews
that's
right
fine. I'd like to ask you a question about why you pushed WPATH to remove age minimums for treatment.
I'm sorry, I'm not giving interviews right now. Thank you, though.
Do you think that HHS should be involved in medical guideline development?
I'm not giving interviews right now, but it's very nice to meet you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I tried really hard to give the benefit of the doubt to the organization, as well as to, providers in the field and clinics, and, and I've stayed loyal to WPATH. I'm still a member, but as more and more comes out in the news about some of this behind the scenes, involvement, it's hard to not feel very disillusioned and disheartened with what's happened.
Seeing the corruption, seeing the manipulation on the part of the medical organizations. And it's sort of smoking gun emails that are very difficult to ignore. It starts to appear as if the clinicians and researchers are more committed to the treatment model than they are to the patient. And that's extremely dangerous, right? They're committed to an approach. A medical protocol is valuable insofar as it best realizes, other values like the protection and promotion of health. There's nothing intrinsically valuable about a treatment regime, a treatment protocol, but they've become so committed to this particular protocol that they're willing to sacrifice accurate language in their guidelines that doctors rely on in order to protect the protocol.
For young people, the impact of what we do is lifelong. Obviously, some treatments are reversible, but some aren't. And obviously, because in this area, young people are in such a dynamic state, they are developing their identity, they're developing their sexuality and their sexual orientation, their brain is developing, and so that the stakes for what you do for young people is really high because of the lifetime consequences. And so often people will err on the side of caution, of keeping young people's options open.
Those consequences can include loss of sexual function and fertility, bone loss, and increased risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Still, this multi-billion-dollar industry is projected to double by 2030, or was. In January, President Trump issued an executive order calling for an end to hormonal and surgical transition in minors. In June, the Supreme Court issued its ruling, allowing state bans to stand. Since then, major clinics have closed or limited services. Families are understandably panicked, and the trans community feels attacked by a right-wing administration hostile to diversity. So while activists may agree with limiting interventions to adults, they're not exactly celebrating.
The problem right now is that we are so politicized. I actually, in some ways, feel like we're in a worse position than we were before these executive orders. Before the executive orders, we could have or see a little bit more conversation with what we would refer to as our side. And now they're so dug in and are just getting more and more like in crisis and chaos.
Even those of us who have been concerned about the risk-benefit profile of these interventions, I think we have good reason to be concerned about the risk-benefit profile of involuntary detransition, especially in a climate where the messaging is so aggressive. This is not, we're not getting a lot of compassionate language from the White House. We're getting some very aggressive, antagonistic language. And so I'm concerned, I think we should all be concerned about the youth who are caught up in all this.
The question is, if WPATH traded the integrity of its guidelines to promote a costly medical pathway, whom are they serving?